They told him his children were broken. They told him silence was the only medicine for their fragile minds. But on a night when the snow buried the lies of the Hamptons billionaire Julian Thorne, walked into a room he was forbidden to enter and found a symphony where there should have been silence. He didn't know it yet, but the maid he was about to fire was the only mother his children had ever known. The storm wasn't just outside, it was brewing right in the chest of Julian Thorne. The windshield wipers on his black SUV fought a losing battle against the whiteout conditions of the Hamptons. His private flight to Zurich had been grounded by the blizzard of the century, and for the first time in 6 months the CEO of Thorne Biotech was coming home unannounced. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He wasn't a man who liked surprises, and he certainly didn't like the feeling of his own $40 million estate looking like a tomb. He expected the iron gates to be manned by security. They weren't. He expected the driveway to be plowed and the porch lights to be blazing. They weren't. The house sat in total darkness, swallowed by the winter night. A cold shiver that had nothing to do with the freezing wind crawled up his spine as he stepped out of the car. Where was the staff? Where was Vanessa? He punched the security code into the front door, the electronic beep echoing too loudly in the massive, empty foyer. Silence. That was the rule. Vanessa had drilled it into him 1,000 times since the triplets were diagnosed. The boys have sensory processing disorder, Julian. Noise hurts them physically. It causes seizures. We must keep the West Wing silent. Dead silent. He had spent millions soundproofing the nursery, treating his own sons like fragile glass dolls that would shatter if the world spoke too loudly. He loosened his tie, his footsteps heavy on the cold marble floor. The house smelled stale, like expensive furniture that no one ever touched. He headed toward the West Wing, intending to check on Liam, Noah, and Ethan. He expected to find them sedated, sleeping in their dark, soundproof bubble as the doctors ordered. But as he neared the heavy oak double doors that separated the main house from the children's quarters, he stopped dead in his tracks. It wasn't silence. It was a sound that shouldn't exist in this house. A sound that was strictly forbidden. Music. And not just a radio left on by a careless cleaner. This was a violin. It was sharp, fast, and impossibly precise. The melody was complex, weaving through the air with a life of its own. It cut through the stale atmosphere of the hallway like a knife. Julian's breath hitched. Who dared to play music in the forbidden zone? Who dared to risk his children's health like this? Rage boiled up in his throat, hot and blinding. Vanessa was right. The staff was incompetent. Someone was tormenting his sick boys, likely mocking their disability while the parents were away. He imagined his sons cowering in their beds, hands over their ears, convulsing in pain from the noise. He reached for the cold brass handle of the nursery door. His hand trembled not from the cold, but from a fury he hadn't felt in years. He was ready to fire whoever was inside. He was ready to tear the world apart to protect his sons. He turned the handle, totally unaware that the door he was opening would close the chapter on his blindness forever. He pushed the door open. The heavy oak door gave way under Julian's hand, but the darkness he expected to find on the other side was gone. He had prepared himself for a tomb, for a room sealed tight against the world with blackout curtains and the heavy, suffocating scent of medicine. Instead, he was blinded by light. It wasn't the harsh glare of hospital fluorescence. It was a soft golden glow that spilled from floor lamps draped in warm fabrics. The air didn't smell like sickness. It smelled of lavender and old wood. Julian stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes struggling to comprehend the impossible scene unfolding before him. The room that was supposed to be a prison for his broken children had been transformed into a sanctuary, and standing in the center of this golden light was Simone Williams. She was not wearing the stiff gray uniform that defined her station in his household. Gone was the apron, gone was the subservient posture of the help. She was dressed in a soft, oversized knitted sweater that hung loosely over her frame, looking comfortable and undeniably human. Her eyes were closed, her chin resting gently on the body of a violin. Her arm moved with a fluidity that mesmerized him, drawing a rich, vibrant sound from the strings that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards beneath his feet. But it wasn't Simone who stole the air from Julian's lungs. It was the trio surrounding her, Liam, Noah, and Ethan, his sons. The specialists had told him they were vegetative. The doctors Vanessa hired had shown him charts, proving their brains were incapable of processing complex patterns. Yet here they were. They were not lying in bed staring at the ceiling. They were sitting up alert and alive. Ethan was holding a small triangle, his eyes locked on Simone's bow, waiting for his cue with the intense focus of a professional. Noah was pressing his lips to a wooden flute, his small fingers moving deftly over the holes, producing a soft, whistling harmony that wove perfectly into Simone's melody. They were playing Mozart. Eine kleine Nachtmusik, a piece of music that required timing, memory, and soul. Julian's gaze drifted to the floor and his heart stopped cold. Liam, the son the doctor said had the cognitive function of a 6-month-old infant. The boy who was never supposed to read, never supposed to write, never supposed to understand the world. Liam was down on his hands and knees, but he wasn't rocking in distress. He was holding a piece of white chalk. On the dark, polished wood of the floor, Liam was writing. Not scribbles, not random lines. He was drawing musical notes, quarter notes, rests, a treble clef, perfectly curved. He was transcribing the music he heard in real time. The realization hit Julian like a physical blow. It wasn't a miracle, it was a revelation. They hadn't been sick, they had been starved. Starved of light, starved of sound, starved of belief. And this woman, this maid he was about to fire, was the only one who had fed them. The music reached a joyful, triumphant crescendo. The boys were smiling. For the first time in 3 years, Julian saw his children smile. The shock was too much for his grip to handle. His leather briefcase slipped from his sweating fingers. The heavy bag hit the floor with a thunderous crash that sounded like a gunshot in the sanctuary. The music died instantly. The triangle clattered to the floor. The flute fell silent. 3 pairs of terrified eyes snapped toward the door, and the golden illusion shattered into a million pieces. The silence that followed the crash was deafening. Julian took a step forward, his arms instinctively opening to embrace the sons he hadn't seen in months. He expected a reunion. He expected relief. But what he got was a reaction that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The boys didn't run to him. They didn't smile. At the sight of their father standing tall in his dark coat, terror washed over their small faces. It was primal, absolute fear. Noah dropped his flute. Ethan scrambled backwards so fast he tripped over his own feet. They didn't run away from the room. They ran to her. Like frightened animals seeking shelter from a storm, all 3 triplets bolted toward Simone. They grabbed the hem of her oversized sweater, burying their faces in the wool, their small bodies shaking violently. Julian stood frozen, his arms still half raised, rejected by his own flesh and blood. Then came the voice. Not a cry, but a plea. Noah the boy. Julian had been told couldn't form a single syllable, peeked out from behind Simone's leg. His eyes were wide with panic tears streaming down his face. Don't inject me! Noah screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. Don't inject me. I'm good. I promise I'm good. The words hit Julian like physical blows. Inject. Why would his son scream about injections? Confusion morphed instantly into protective rage. He looked at the woman who had his children clinging to her like a lifeline. In his mind, she must have brainwashed them. She must be the source of this madness. What have you done to them? Julian roared, his voice shaking the walls. Get away from my children. He took a threatening step forward, expecting the maid to cower, to apologize, to run. But Simone Williams didn't move an inch. She didn't flinch. Instead, she spread her arms wide, creating a human shield between the billionaire and his sons. Her posture wasn't that of a servant. It was the stance of a mother protecting her cubs from a predator. Her eyes weren't submissive. They were blazing with a fire that matched his own. She looked him dead in the eye, a look that defied every rule of her employment. "I am not hurting them," she said, her voice low and dangerous, vibrating with suppressed anger. "I am teaching them how to breathe. I am teaching them that they have voices." Julian pointed a trembling finger at her. "You are confusing them. You are making them regress. Move aside before I call the police." "I will not move," Simone countered, her voice rising. "Look at them, Mr. Thorne. Really look at them. They are not mute. They are not broken. They are imprisoned. They are terrified of you because they think you are the one who orders the needles." The accusation hung in the air, thick and heavy. Julian froze. He looked at Noah, still whimpering about needles. He looked at Simone's defiant stance. For the first time, doubt cracked the armor of his certainty. But before he could process the impossible truth staring him in the face, the sound of sharp, rhythmic clicking echoed from the hallway floor. Click, click, click. It was the sound of authority, the sound of expensive stilettos hitting hardwood. The heavy footsteps stopped right behind Julian, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Vanessa was home. The woman standing in the doorway was a masterpiece of calculated distress. Vanessa Sterling did not look like the composed socialite who graced the covers of Hamptons magazines. Her designer coat was soaked through dark water, dripping onto the hardwood floor. Her platinum blonde hair was plastered to her face in chaotic strands, and her chest was heaving as if she had run all the way from the city in the blizzard. She took in the scene in a split second. She saw the violin in Simone's hand. She saw the chalk on the floor. She saw the alertness in the triplets' eyes. But she didn't see a miracle. She saw a threat. She saw her $5 billion retirement plan waking up. Vanessa didn't scream. She didn't ask what was happening. She launched herself across the room with the ferocity of a wild animal protecting its territory. Before Julian could even process her arrival, Vanessa was on top of Simone. The sound of the slap was louder than the thunder outside. It was a vicious, open-handed strike that snapped Simone's head to the side. The violin clattered to the floor, the bridge snapping under the impact. "Are you trying to kill them?" Vanessa shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that shattered the air. "You stupid, ignorant girl! I told you their brains cannot handle stimulation. I told you silence was the only thing keeping them alive." Simone staggered back, her hand flying to her stinging cheek, but she didn't retreat. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell the truth, to scream that the boys had been happy, but Vanessa gave her no room to breathe. The blonde woman spun around and collapsed against Julian's chest, her body trembling violently, her sobs racking her frame. "Julian! Oh, God! Julian, you have to stop her!" Vanessa cried, digging into her pocket with a frantic wet hand. She pulled out a crumpled, damp piece of paper and shoved it into Julian's face. "Look at this. My father just sent the new neurological report. Look at it, Julian. It says right here that auditory stimulation over 60 decibels causes immediate swelling in their frontal cortex. It causes aneurysms." Julian looked down at the paper. The ink was running, but the medical letterhead of Sterling Medical Group was clear. The words seizure, hemorrhage, and permanent damage leaped out at him. His heart stopped. He looked from the weeping woman in his arms to the maid standing by the broken violin. Panic, cold and irrational, began to choke him. He had just walked in on what he thought was music, but Vanessa was telling him it was murder. "See," Vanessa screamed, pointing a manicured finger at the boys. "Look what she's done. Look at them." Julian turned to his sons, and that was when the nightmare truly began. The triplets were no longer standing. They were no longer playing instruments. At the sight of Vanessa, at the sound of her voice, a switch had been flipped in their small bodies. It wasn't the music that did it. It was a Pavlovian response to their tormentor. Liam's eyes rolled back in his head. His small body went rigid, locking up in a terrifying arch. Noah dropped to the floor, his hands clawing at his throat, foaming slightly at the mouth. Ethan curled into a fetal ball, letting out a high-pitched keen of pure animalistic terror. They were seizing. To Julian, it looked exactly like what Vanessa had predicted. He didn't see 3 children terrified of the abuser. He saw 3 delicate brains short-circuiting because of the violin. The lie became the truth right before his eyes. Guilt, heavy and suffocating, crashed down on him. He had let this happen. He had let the maid hurt them. Vanessa didn't help the boys. She clung tighter to Julian, wailing into his coat. "She killed them," Vanessa sobbed. "She killed our babies." Fear is a blinding poison, and in that moment, Julian Thorne was blind. He didn't see 3 terrified children reacting to their abuser. He didn't see the Pavlovian response of trauma. All he saw was the medical nightmare he had dreaded for years finally coming true. His sons were seizing. Their fragile brains were short-circuiting, just as the expensive doctors predicted, and it was all because of this woman and her violin. Logic vanished. Instinct took over. Julian didn't see Simone as a miracle worker anymore. He saw her as a threat. A dangerous, uneducated intruder who had broken into a sterile environment and contaminated it with chaos. "Get away from them!" Julian roared. He didn't wait for her to comply. The billionaire crossed the room in 2 strides and shoved Simone. It wasn't a gentle nudge. It was a forceful, desperate push that sent her stumbling backward. Her shoulder collided hard with the doorframe, but she didn't cry out. "Julian, listen to me!" Simone screamed, fighting to stay upright. "This isn't a seizure. It is a panic attack. Look at their eyes." But Julian wasn't listening. He was kneeling beside Noah, terrified by the foam gathering at the boy's mouth. Vanessa was the one in control now. She was moving with the terrifying efficiency of a predator disguised as a savior. She didn't comfort the children. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a silver case. "Hold him down, Julian," Vanessa commanded, her voice sharp and authoritative. She wasn't the weeping fiancée anymore. She was the daughter of the sterling medical empire. "Hold Liam down. I have to stop the synapse firing before he has a stroke." "No." Simone lunged forward. "Don't give him that. It is too strong. Security!" Julian bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Get her out of here. Now!" 2 burly men in black suits materialized from the hallway, alerted by the noise. They grabbed Simone by the arms, their grip bruising and cruel. As they dragged her back, she saw Vanessa uncap the needle. The tip glinted under the warm lights. Vanessa didn't hesitate. She jammed the needle into Liam's small thigh with a brutality that made Simone wince. "Check their pupils." Simone shrieked, her feet sliding uselessly on the polished floor as the guards hauled her away. "Look at their pupils, Julian. They are dilated from fear, not constricted from a seizure. That shot will stop his heart." But it was too late. The plunger went down. Liam's arching back instantly went limp. His eyes rolled back and closed. The silence returned to the room, heavy and suffocating. To Julian, it looked like peace. It looked like medicine working. To Simone, it looked like a coma. "Get her out." Julian stood up, shaking with adrenaline. He looked at Simone with eyes cold enough to freeze the storm outside. "You are fired. If I ever see you near my property again, if I even see your car on this street, I will have you arrested for child endangerment and assault." Vanessa looked up from Liam's unconscious body. She smoothed her wet hair back and gave Simone a small, imperceptible smirk. It was a look of pure victory. "Drag her out." Julian ordered the guards, turning his back on the only person who had ever truly loved his children. "Throw her in the snow." The doors slammed shut. The lock clicked. And Simone was left standing in the freezing blizzard. The image of Liam's lifeless body burned into her retinas. She had lost her job. She had lost her reputation. But as the cold wind bit into her skin, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a witness. The grip of the security guards was iron-tight, bruising Simone's arms through her sweater, but she didn't fight them. She didn't scream or beg for her job. She walked with a dignity that seemed to mock the brutality of the moment. The storm outside was raging, wind howling against the windows like a beast trying to get in, but the silence inside the hallway was colder. Julian stood by the heavy mahogany doors, his face a mask of conflict. He wanted to feel righteous. He wanted to believe he was protecting his children from a dangerous woman. But as Simone was dragged past him, she didn't look at him with anger. She looked at him with pity. It was a look that cut deeper than any insult. It was the look one gives to a man who is watching his own house burn down and refusing to hold a hose. "Wait!" Simone gasped, stumbling as they reached the threshold. One of the guards shoved her forward, impatient to be done with the task. But Simone used the momentum. She didn't fall away from Julian, she fell toward him. It happened in a blur. To the guards and to Vanessa, watching smugly from the top of the stairs, it looked like a desperate, clumsy attempt to grab onto her employer for mercy. Simone's body collided with Julian's chest. For a split second, the billionaire was forced to catch her to keep them both from toppling over. "Get off him," the guard barked, reaching for her collar. But in that chaotic second of contact, Simone's hand moved with the precision of a surgeon. She didn't grab his lapel. Her fingers slipped unseen into the side pocket of his tailored suit jacket. She deposited something small, hard, and crinkling slightly, an object, no bigger than a fingernail, wrapped in a shiny candy wrapper. Julian stiffened, feeling the intrusion, but before he could push her away, she pulled herself close, her lips brushing his ear. "If you have any conscience left as a father," she whispered, her voice a rush of hot air against his cold skin. "Watch this when you are alone. Do not let her see it. And check the trash can in her bathroom." The guards ripped her away before Julian could respond. The physical separation was violent, tearing the moment apart. They dragged her out into the swirling white void of the night. "You are making a mistake," Simone called out, not screaming, but stating a fact. "A terrible mistake." And then she was gone. The heavy double doors slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the cavernous foyer. The sound was like a prison cell locking. The warmth of the house returned instantly, but Julian felt colder than he had ever felt in his life. He stood there staring at the closed door, his hand hovering over his pocket, where the small, mysterious object burned against his side. Vanessa descended the stairs, her heels clicking victoriously. She wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. "It is better this way, darling," she purred. "The house is peaceful again." Julian didn't answer. He looked at the woman he was going to marry, then back at the door that separated him from the truth. The peace felt heavy. It felt like a lie, and for the first time he realized that silence wasn't safety. It was just silence. The blizzard outside had settled into a low, mournful howl, wrapping the Thorne estate in a blanket of white isolation. Inside, the silence was absolute. It was the heavy, chemically induced silence that Vanessa demanded, the kind that felt less like peace and more like a mausoleum. Julian sat in his study, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. He wasn't looking at the quarterly projections for his company or the stock market reports glowing on his tablet. He was staring at a piece of trash. In the center of his palm lay the crinkled, shiny wrapper of a cheap strawberry candy. It was the object Simone had pressed into his hand, the Trojan horse that carried a tiny black SD card. He rolled the wrapper between his fingers. It felt ridiculous. He was a man of science, a man of facts. He shouldn't be listening to a disgraced maid who had been dragged out of his house by security. He should be upstairs in bed next to his beautiful, grieving fiancée. But he couldn't move. Every time he closed his eyes, he didn't see Vanessa's tears. He saw Liam. He saw the way Liam's eyes had tracked the movement of the violin bow. Sharp, alert, alive. Those were not the eyes of a child with severe cognitive delay. Those were the eyes of a boy who understood rhythm and structure. For 3 years, Julian had only seen glazed expressions and drooling mouths. Today, for 10 minutes, he had seen a son. Was it possible that the diagnosis was wrong? Or worse, was it possible the diagnosis was being manufactured? "Check the trash can in her bathroom." Simone's whisper echoed in his head louder than the wind. Julian stood up. The leather chair creaked, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. He had to know. He walked out into the hallway, moving like a thief in his own home. He pushed open the door to the master bedroom. Vanessa was asleep, her breathing deep and rhythmic, her platinum hair fanned out over the silk pillows like a halo. She looked angelic. She looked innocent. Guilt pricked at Julian's chest. He was betraying her trust based on the word of a stranger. But then he remembered the needle plunging into Liam's leg, and the guilt vanished, replaced by a cold resolve. He slipped into the ensuite bathroom, the marble floor cold against his socks. It smelled of expensive perfume and sanitized cleanliness. He knelt beside the small wicker wastebasket tucked under the vanity. He felt insane. He was a billionaire digging through garbage. He pushed aside used cotton rounds and tissues. Nothing. He dug deeper. His fingers brushed against something hard and plastic at the very bottom, hidden beneath a layer of discarded makeup wipes. He pulled it out. It was a small glass vial. Julian held it up to the moonlight filtering through the frosted window. It wasn't a prescription bottle from a pharmacy. There was no patient name, no dosage instructions, no doctor's signature. It was a clinical amber vial with a single white sticker. On it was a printed code, ST Lab 409. Sterling Laboratories, Vanessa's father's company. Why would a simple vitamin or sedative need to be smuggled home in a lab vial? And why hide the empty bottle at the bottom of the trash instead of the recycling bin? A chill that had nothing to do with the bathroom tiles shot through Julian's veins. Simone was right. There was something in this house that didn't belong. He pocketed the vial and the candy wrapper. He backed out of the bathroom, casting one last look at the sleeping form of the woman he intended to marry. She didn't stir. She had no idea that the blindfold she had tied around his eyes had just slipped. Julian returned to his study and locked the heavy door. The click of the deadbolt sounded like a declaration of war. He sat down at his desk and pulled out the tiny SD card from the wrapper. His hands trembled slightly as he inserted it into his computer. The screen flickered to life, asking to open the files. Julian took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever horror lay on the drive, and clicked play. The loading bar on the computer screen crawled forward with agonizing slowness before blinking into a grainy, pixelated image. The angle was low and distorted, filming through the plastic eye of a teddy bear sitting on a shelf. It gave the room a warped, fisheye perspective that made everything look like a nightmare. The timestamp in the corner read 2 weeks ago. Julian leaned closer to the monitor, his breath held tight in his chest. On the screen, the door to the nursery opened. Vanessa walked in. She wasn't wearing her public mask of the doting stepmother-to-be. She was wearing a silk robe that shimmered in the nightlight, and her face was twisted into a sneer of pure disgust. She didn't check if the boys were covered. She prowled toward Ethan's bed. The boy was asleep, defenseless. On the video, Vanessa grabbed Ethan by the jaw. Her grip was vicious, her manicured fingers digging into his soft cheeks until his mouth was forced open. Ethan thrashed his legs, kicking under the blanket, but she used her body weight to pin him down. "Drink it," she hissed. The audio on the hidden camera was tinny but crystal clear. Julian watched in horror as she poured a thick purple liquid from the unlabeled vial down his son's throat. Ethan gagged and choked, tears streaming from his eyes, but she clamped a hand over his mouth and pinched his nose, forcing him to swallow the poison. "You little freaks," Vanessa whispered, her face inches from the terrified boy. "You just have to stay dumb for 2 more years. Just 2 more years until I marry your father and sign the papers. Then you can rot in an institution for all I care. But until then, you stay quiet." Julian felt bile rise in his throat. He watched the woman he shared a bed with, the woman he planned to trust with his life, systematically destroying the minds of his children for a payout. The video cut to black, and then a new file started. The timestamp changed to 3 hours later. 3:00 a.m. The door opened again. This time it was Simone. She didn't turn on the lights. She moved quickly to Ethan's bed. She shook him gently awake, whispering urgent words that the microphone barely picked up. She pulled a small basin from under the bed and stuck her finger down the boy's throat. Julian flinched as he watched his son retch, vomiting up the purple liquid. Simone rubbed his back, soothing him, cleaning his face with a tenderness that broke Julian's heart. But she didn't stop there. Once the boy was clean, she didn't tell him to go back to sleep. She pulled out a flashcard. In the dim light, she held it up. C, she whispered. C is for cat. Can you say cat? Ethan, the boy who had just been poisoned, looked at her with adoring eyes. He didn't speak, but he tapped the card twice. Simone kissed his forehead. You are smart, she told him fiercely. You are so smart, Ethan. Don't let them take your mind. You fight them. You fight them with me. The video ended. The screen went black. A primal roar ripped through Julian's chest. He didn't scream a name. He didn't cry. He channeled every ounce of his rage into his right hand. He brought his fist down onto the solid oak desk with the force of a sledgehammer. Crack! The sound of wood splintering mixed with the sickening crunch of bone. Pain shot up his arm, hot and blinding, but it was nothing compared to the agony in his soul. He pulled his hand back. His knuckles were split open, blood dripping onto the polished wood, staining the expensive finish. He looked at the blood. It was real. The pain was real. And the monster sleeping upstairs was real. He had the truth now, or at least half of it. He knew who the villain was. Now he had to go get the hero he had just thrown out into the snow. The sunrise over Manhattan brought no warmth to Julian Thorne. It only brought a name and an address delivered by a private investigator who charged $5,000 an hour. The destination was a world away from the gilded gates of the Hamptons and the steel towers of his company. It was the South Bronx. Julian parked his luxury SUV between a rusted sedan and a dumpster overflowing with trash. He felt the eyes of the neighborhood on him, measuring him, judging the intruder in the bespoke suit. He didn't care. He climbed 4 flights of stairs that smelled of stale cigarettes and boiled cabbage, his heart pounding not from exertion, but from a desperate hope. He knocked on door 4B. When Simone opened the door, she didn't look surprised. She looked tired. She was wearing a worn-out t-shirt and sweatpants, her hair wrapped in a silk scarf. She didn't step back to let him in. She stood her ground, blocking the entrance to her sanctuary. You found me fast, she said, her voice flat. Did you come to have me arrested, or just to yell some more? I came to talk. Julian said, his voice hoarse. Please. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the arrogance he had worn yesterday. Finding none, she stepped aside. The apartment was a shoebox. The paint was peeling in the corners, and the radiator rattled with an ominous clank. It was the home of someone living on the edge of survival. But as Julian looked around, his eyes widened. There were no luxury items. There was barely any furniture. But there were books, stacks and stacks of them lining the walls and spilling onto the floor. They weren't romance novels or magazines. They were heavy leather-bound medical texts, advanced pediatric neurology, clinical pharmacology, the ethics of patient care. Julian picked up a journal from the coffee table. It was dog-eared and underlined with frantic notes. You are not just a maid, he said, turning to face her. Maids don't read neurosurgery textbooks for fun. Simone laughed, a dry, bitter sound that held no humor. She walked over to a small, battered dresser and pulled out a framed certificate. The glass was cracked, but the gold seal was still visible. She handed it to him. Simone Williams, head pediatric nurse, Mount Sinai Hospital. I was the youngest head nurse in the department's history, Simone said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. I was on track to be a director. Until I noticed a discrepancy in the pharmacy inventory. High-grade experimental sedatives were vanishing. And do you know whose signature was on the transfer orders? Julian looked at her, dread pooling in his stomach. Dr. Sterling, Simone said, spitting the name out like poison. Vanessa's father. When I reported him to the board, I thought I was doing the right thing. 2 days later, police found 3 ounces of cocaine in my locker. I lost my license. I lost my pension. I lost my name. I was blacklisted from every hospital in the state. Julian stared at the certificate, the pieces of the puzzle slamming into place. The cruelty, the power, the way Vanessa had looked at Simone with such hatred. I took the job cleaning your toilets because I heard rumors about your sons. Simone continued, tears finally welling in her eyes. I knew what Sterling was capable of. I didn't come to your house to dust your shelves, Julian. I came because I knew those boys were being chemically restrained. I came to save them because no one else would. For the first time in his life, the billionaire felt small. He stood in a room worth less than his shoes and looked at a woman whose integrity was worth more than his entire company. He had thrown her into the snow. He had called her ignorant, and all the while, she was the only expert in the room. Julian slowly lowered himself onto the lumpy sofa, burying his face in his hands. The weight of his own blindness was crushing. I am sorry, he whispered. The words felt foreign but necessary. I am so sorry. I didn't know. Simone didn't hug him. She didn't offer cheap comfort. She sat across from him, her eyes sharp and ready for war. She leaned forward, her demeanor shifting from victim to commander. Apologies don't save children, Julian. Plans do. If we are going to stop them, we have to be smarter than them. So tell me, are you done being a billionaire and ready to be a father? Julian lifted his head. His eyes were dry and hard. Tell me what to do. Julian reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the emergency dial. His face was a mask of cold fury. I am ending this now, he growled, the veins in his neck standing out against his collar. I am calling the police commissioner. I am having that woman dragged out of my house in handcuffs before lunch. He started to type, his movements jerky and aggressive, fueled by the image of his son choking on poison. Put the phone down, Julian. Simone's voice was sharp, cutting through his rage like a scalpel. She didn't shout, but the authority in her tone made the billionaire freeze. He looked up, confused by her hesitation. You don't understand how this works, Simone said, stepping closer and gently lowering his hand. You think the law applies to people like the Sterlings? Her father practically owns the medical board. He is the biggest donor to the local police precinct. If you call them now, they won't arrest Vanessa. They will call her father. And by the time the squad car pulls up to your gate, the evidence will be gone, the medical records will be altered, and I will be painted as a disgruntled, lying maid who tried to frame her employers. Julian stared at her, the reality of the corruption sinking in. He wanted to scream, but he knew she was right. He was rich, but the Sterlings were entrenched. They were the system. So what do we do? Julian asked, his voice breaking. Do I just let her keep poisoning them? Do I watch her destroy my sons while we wait for a miracle? No, Simone said, her eyes narrowing. We don't wait for a miracle. We build a trap. She walked to her cramped kitchen counter and picked up a small glass vial. It was identical to the one Julian had found in the trash. The liquid inside was a deep, ominous purple. She held it up to the light. It looked deadly. It looked exactly like the chemical cocktail Vanessa forced down Ethan's throat. Sugar water and food coloring, Simone said, handing the vial to Julian. It is harmless, it is sweet, and it is going to save their lives. Julian took the small bottle. It felt heavy in his hand, heavier than any contract he had ever signed. You have to go back there, Simone instructed, her voice softening, but remaining firm. You have to go back and be the husband she expects. You have to apologize for yelling. You have to buy her flowers. You have to kiss her and tell her you were stressed. You have to make her feel safe, Julian. Because when she feels safe, she gets sloppy. Julian looked at the vial, then at Simone. The thought of touching Vanessa, of smelling her perfume, and pretending to love the monster who was hurting his children made his stomach turn. It was a violation of his soul. You want me to hug the woman who is killing my kids, Julian whispered. I want you to buy us time, Simone corrected. You need to swap her vial with this one. You need to let her think she is winning so we can get the toxicology reports from your lab. We need undeniable proof. We need to catch her when the whole world is watching." Julian closed his hand around the fake medicine. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of old books and integrity that filled Simone's apartment. He nodded slowly. "I will do it," he said, his voice steel. He stood up and buttoned his coat. He was no longer just a businessman. He was an actor preparing for the role of a lifetime. The drive back to the Hamptons would be long, but the walk through his own front door, the act of smiling at the enemy, would be the hardest journey of his life. He looked at Simone one last time, drawing strength from her resilience. "I will be back," he promised. Simone watched him go, her hand resting on the medical textbook. "Be careful," she whispered to the empty room. "You are walking into the snake pit." The drive back to the Hamptons felt like a funeral procession for the man Julian used to be. The billionaire who commanded boardrooms and fired executives without blinking was gone. In his place sat a desperate father clutching a velvet box in one hand and a vial of sugar water in the other. He wasn't going home to rest. He was going undercover in his own life. When he walked through the front door, the house was warm, but the air felt thin. Vanessa was waiting in the drawing room. She sat on the chaise lounge looking like a tragic heroine in a black silk dress, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. It was a perfect performance. Julian didn't say a word. He simply walked over and placed the velvet box on the table before her. Inside lay a diamond necklace worth $250,000. It shimmered under the chandelier, cold and hard. "I am sorry," Julian said, his voice rough. "I was stressed. I shouldn't have yelled." Vanessa looked at the diamonds, then up at him. For a second he saw the calculation in her eyes, weighing the gems against her anger. Then the mask slipped back into place. She reached out and touched his hand, her skin cool and dry. "I forgive you, darling," she whispered. "I know you only want what is best for them." Then came the test. Julian felt his muscles tense as she leaned back, sighing deeply, pressing a hand to her forehead. "I am just so exhausted, Julian," she said, her voice trembling with feigned frailty. "The boys have been screaming all afternoon. My hands are shaking so badly I can't even hold a spoon. Could you give them their evening dose? It would mean so much to me to see you take charge." It was a trap. Julian knew it instantly. She wanted to see if he was truly compliant. She wanted to make him complicit in the abuse to have his fingerprints on the weapon. If he refused, she would know he was lying. "Of course," Julian said, forcing his lips into a stiff smile. "I will take care of it." He walked into the kitchen. It was a sterile white space that looked more like a laboratory than a place for family meals. He knew exactly where the cameras were. Vanessa had installed them under the guise of monitoring the staff, but now they were aimed at him, one above the fridge, one by the pantry. Julian opened the medicine cabinet. The row of amber vials stared back at him. He reached for the bottle labeled for the triplets. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he feared the microphone would pick it up. He felt the weight of the real poison in his left hand. In his right pocket sat Simone's fake vial. He moved to the island counter. He knew he had a blind spot if he turned his back to the fridge. He poured a glass of water, using his broad shoulders to block the camera's view of his hands. His palms were sweating. One slip, one fumble, and the glass would shatter, exposing the swap. With a sleight of hand born of pure adrenaline, he pocketed the real medication and pulled out the sugar water. He uncapped it. The liquid looked identical, deep purple, viscous. He poured it onto the spoon. He walked up the stairs carrying the spoon like it was a loaded gun. Vanessa stood in the nursery doorway watching him. Liam was lying in his bed, his eyes wide with terror as he saw his father approach. The boy whimpered, shrinking back against the headboard. It broke Julian's heart. He had to look like the monster to destroy the monster. "Open up, Liam!" Julian said, his voice firm but his eyes pleading with his son to trust him. "It is just medicine." He brought the spoon to the child's lips. Liam squeezed his eyes shut and swallowed. Julian watched the throat muscles work, praying the boy wouldn't spit it out and reveal the sweet taste. Liam swallowed. He blinked, looking confused. It didn't burn. It tasted like candy. Good boy, Julian said, his voice cracking. From the doorway, Vanessa smiled. It was the smile of a predator who thought the trap had snapped shut. But as Julian turned around, hiding his trembling hands, he knew the truth. She hadn't caught him. He had just walked right past her defenses. The glass walls of Thorne Biotech usually reflected a man of power, a titan of industry who controlled the future of medicine. But tonight, as Julian paced the sterile white floor of the toxicology department, the reflection showed only a terrified father. It was 2 a.m. The building was empty except for Julian and Dr. Aris, the company's lead biochemist, who had been summoned out of bed for an emergency that could not exist on any official record. The centrifuge on the counter slowed to a halt with a soft hiss. Inside sat the vial of purple liquid Julian had stolen from his own kitchen. The poison his fiancée had tried to feed his son just hours ago. Dr. Aris pulled the sample out and placed it under the mass spectrometer. Julian watched the man's face. He saw the moment the data hit the screen. He saw the blood drain from the scientist's complexion, turning him as white as his lab coat. Aris took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes as if hoping the numbers would change. They didn't. "What is it?" Julian asked, his voice echoing in the empty lab. "I need you to sit down, Mr. Thorne." Dr. Aris said, his voice trembling slightly. "I am not sitting down. Tell me what she is giving them." "Doctor." Aris pointed to the jagged peaks on the monitor. "This is not medication, Julian. This is a weapon. The base is a high-concentration synthetic opioid strong enough to knock out a grown man, let alone a 4-year-old child. That explains the lethargy and the drooling. But that is the kindness in this bottle." "Kindness?" Julian repeated, feeling bile rise in his throat. "The opioid is just the delivery system." Aris continued, tapping a second darker spike on the graph. "This compound here is similar to a neuroinhibitor we stopped testing 5 years ago because it was too dangerous. It targets the Broca's area of the brain, the language center. It doesn't just suppress speech, Julian. It chemically atrophies the neural pathways used for communication." Julian gripped the edge of the steel table, his knuckles turned white. She wasn't just drugging them, she was chemically lobotomizing them. She was erasing their ability to speak, to think, to be human. "Is it permanent?" Julian whispered. Aris looked at the simulation running on the screen. A model of a child's brain was turning from healthy pink to dead gray. If you had waited another 3 months, yes. The atrophy would have been total. They would have been trapped in their own bodies, fully vegetative, legally brain-dead. 3 months. That was the timeline. That was exactly when the wedding was scheduled. Vanessa was timing their destruction to coincide perfectly with her access to the trust fund. Julian didn't throw a chair. He didn't scream. A cold, deadly calm settled over him. It was the calm of a man who had just decided to destroy someone. He walked out of the lab, leaving Dr. Aris staring at the horrific data. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It rang once. "David," Julian said. David Rosen, the most ruthless criminal attorney in New York, answered with a sleepy grogginess that vanished the moment he heard Julian's tone. "Julian, it's 3 a.m. "What's wrong? I need you to draft a new will," Julian said, walking toward the elevator. "And then I need you to prepare a case file for the district attorney." "Is this a divorce?" David asked. "Do you want a prenup canceled?" "No," Julian said, stepping into the night air. "I don't want a divorce. I want a murder charge. I want you to find every loophole, every contact, and every statute necessary to ensure that Vanessa Sterling never sees the sun again. I don't want a plea deal, David. I want life without parole. I want her to die in a concrete box." The sun was rising over the Manhattan skyline, but inside the corner office of Rosen and Associates, the mood was darker than midnight. David Rosen, a man who had made his fortune defending the indefensible, looked pale. He sat behind a desk piled high with dusty legal binders, his tie loosened and his eyes bloodshot. Julian sat across from him holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. "You were looking for a prenup violation, Julian," David said, his voice grave. "But you were looking in the wrong place. I went back further. I pulled the original trust documents established by your late wife when the triplets were born." Julian leaned forward. "What did you find?" David opened a thick file and spun it around. He pointed to a paragraph highlighted in yellow. It was dense legal jargon, the kind designed to bore people into skipping it. Clause 14, Section B. David read aloud. "The $5 billion charitable trust is designated for the welfare of the children. However, there is a contingency. If the beneficiaries are declared permanently mentally incapacitated, before their 5th birthday, control of the entire principal sum transfers immediately to their legal guardian to ensure lifelong care." The room went silent. The hum of the air conditioner seemed to scream. Julian stared at the words. Permanently incapacitated. Before their 5th birthday. "The boys turn 5 next week," Julian whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. David nodded grimly. "If they die, the money goes to the Red Cross. Vanessa gets nothing. But if they live, if they survive as breathing, eating, sleeping vegetables who cannot speak or sign their own names, she gets control of the checkbook. She doesn't want to kill them, Julian. She wants to farm them. To her, they aren't children. They are livestock. She needs them alive enough to qualify for the trust, but dead enough not to object when she spends $5 billion on herself." A wave of nausea crashed over Julian. The cruelty was so calculated, so industrial, it was almost impossible to comprehend. Vanessa had been poisoning his sons, not out of hatred, but out of simple accounting. She was manufacturing disability for profit. She was turning his bright musical genius sons into living ghosts, just to unlock a bank account. "She is going to do it soon," David warned. "She is running out of time. She needs a public spectacle. She needs a doctor to witness a major medical event to seal the diagnosis before their birthday." As if summoned by the devil himself, Julian's phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. The screen lit up with a notification from Vanessa. It was a mass invite sent to the entire social register of New York. The subject line read, "The Children's Hope Gala." Julian picked up the phone, his hand trembling with rage. He read the message. "My darling friends," Vanessa wrote. "Tomorrow night we will host the most important evening of the year. I will be presenting my brave, fragile stepsons to the world to raise awareness for their rare condition. Please join us to witness their journey." Witness their journey. She meant witness their execution. She was going to parade them in front of the cameras, induce a massive seizure or a stroke right on stage and let the world watch them break. It would be the perfect tragedy. The grieving stepmother weeping over her broken boys while the ink dried on the check. Julian looked up at David. His eyes were no longer the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a man who had nothing left to lose. "She wants a show," Julian said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "She wants the world to watch." David closed the file. "Then let's give her an audience she will never forget." The Children's Hope Gala was the kind of event where champagne flowed like water, and the checkbooks of the elite opened wide for a good sob story. For Vanessa Sterling, it was not just a party, it was payday. She stood in front of her floor-to-length mirror, holding up a modest black dress. It was carefully chosen to make her look thinner, paler, and exhausted. It was the costume of a saintly woman burdened by the tragedy of caring for 3 invalid children. She picked up her phone and dialed her father's private line. Her voice was crisp and businesslike, devoid of any maternal warmth. "Make sure the car is here at 6, she ordered, "and tell the nurse to prepare the travel kits. I want the boys sedated before we even leave the driveway." She paused, listening to the voice on the other end, then shook her head impatiently. "No, that is not enough. They were twitching yesterday. I cannot have them drooling or making those awful noises while I am giving my speech. Double the dose. There was a silence on the line as even the corrupt doctor on the other end hesitated. Doubling the dose of a neuroinhibitor mixed with opioids was risky. It pushed the line between sedation and coma. Just do it. Vanessa snapped her eyes cold as she checked her makeup. I don't care if their breathing slows down. I need them to be dead weight in those wheelchairs. If they so much as blink during the auction, it ruins the illusion. Just keep them breathing until the donors sign the pledges. After that, they can sleep for a week for all I care. Miles away in her cramped apartment, Simone pressed the headphones tighter against her ears. Her blood ran cold. She was listening to the audio feed from the bug Julian had planted. She knew exactly what that dosage meant. She was a nurse. She knew that doubling that specific cocktail would suppress the respiratory drive. The boys wouldn't just be quiet. Their lungs would forget how to inhale. They would suffocate in their sleep right there on the stage in front of 500 cheering billionaires. Panic threatened to choke her, but she forced it down. She grabbed her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. She didn't call the police. She didn't call an ambulance. She knew Vanessa would talk her way out of it before the sirens even faded. We cannot stop the car, she typed to Julian. If we stop them private, she spins the story. She will say it was a medical emergency. She will kill them slowly next time. She hit send on the next message. We have to let her get to the stage. We have to catch her with the needle in her hand. We save them and we destroy her at the same time. It has to be tonight. In the master bedroom of the Thorne estate, Julian read the text. The phone screen was the only light in the dark room. He looked at the message, then looked at the tuxedo laid out on the bed. It was a suit of armor for a modern battlefield. He walked over to the dresser and picked up a small pearl lapel pin. It looked like a piece of expensive jewelry, but inside the pearl was a high-definition camera lens. He pinned it to his jacket. His hands were steady. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. He was about to let a monster take his children to the edge of death so he could drag them back and bury her. It is time, Julian whispered to the empty room. He put on the jacket. 0 hour had arrived. The Plaza Hotel was a fortress wrapped in velvet and gold leaf. Outside, the paparazzi flashed their cameras like a lightning storm, hungry for a glimpse of the elite, but inside the air smelled of old money and expensive perfume. It was the Children's Hope Gala, the event of the season, where New York's wealthiest gathered to drink champagne and pretend to care about the less fortunate. But tonight the charity was a lie, and the guests were unknowingly attending an execution. Security was tighter than a presidential visit. Men in earpieces lined every corridor, their eyes scanning the crowd for anything out of place. They weren't hotel security. They were private contractors hired by Dr. Sterling Vanessa's father. They weren't looking for terrorists. They were looking for a specific black woman with a history of whistleblowing. But they were looking for Simone Williams, the defiant nurse. They were not looking for the invisible figure pushing a heavy silver cart of hors d'oeuvres toward the service elevator. Simone had vanished. In her place was a nameless server, wearing a cheap polyester uniform that was 2 sizes too big, swallowing her figure completely. A coarse brown wig sat low on her forehead, and thick-rimmed glasses obscured her fierce eyes. She kept her head down, focused on the wheels of the cart, counting her steps to keep her heart from exploding in her chest. She navigated the labyrinth of the service corridors, moving toward the VIP holding area. This was the belly of the beast. The noise of the ballroom faded, replaced by the hushed tension of the backstage area. She turned the corner and her blood froze. Standing directly in front of the double doors that led to the children's room was Dr. Sterling himself. The man who had ruined her career and poisoned an entire generation of children stood like a gatekeeper to hell. He was checking his watch, looking impatient and dangerous. He looked up as the cart rattled. "Stop right there," Sterling barked. Simone stopped. Her grip on the metal handle was so tight her knuckles turned white under her gloves. She didn't look up. She stared at his polished shoes. "Where do you think you are going with that?" he demanded, stepping closer. "The VIP room is closed to catering until after the speech." Panic rose in Simone's throat, hot and sour. If she looked up, he would know her. If she spoke normally, he would recognize the voice that had testified against him. She had to become someone else. She had to become the help he ignored every day of his life. She coughed, a low, rattling sound that came from deep in her chest. She hunched her shoulders, making herself look smaller and frailer. Miss Sterling called for water. Sir Simone rasped, her voice disguised by a heavy fake accent and a gravelly tone. She said the boys are thirsty. Sterling paused. He looked at the cart, then at the woman huddled behind it. His eyes bored into the top of her head. For a terrifying second, time seemed to stop. Simone waited for the hand on her shoulder, waited for the shout of recognition. She had a taser taped to her thigh beneath the baggy trousers, but if she used it here, the plan would fail. Water Sterling muttered with disdain. Fine, make it quick, and do not disturb them. They are resting. He stepped aside. The gatekeeper had moved. Thank you, sir, she wheezed. She pushed the cart forward. The wheels squeaked, a sound that grated on her nerves, but she didn't rush. She walked past the man who had destroyed her life without lifting her head. As soon as she cleared the checkpoint and the heavy doors swung shut behind her, she let out a breath that shook her entire body. She was in. The hallway ahead was dim and quiet. At the end of it lay the room where 3 little boys were waiting for a savior. She abandoned the cart and moved toward the door, her hands trembling not from fear anymore, but from the adrenaline of the hunt. She was no longer the prey. She was the wolf inside the fold. The VIP holding room was draped in heavy velvet and smelled of fresh lilies, but to the 3 small boys huddled in the far corner, it smelled like pure fear. The sounds of the gala were muffled here, reduced to a low, thumping bass line that vibrated through the floorboards. It was a gilded cage designed to keep the ugly truth hidden until the spotlight was ready. Vanessa Sterling stood by the mirrored vanity table. She was not fixing her lipstick. She was flicking the side of a syringe. The clear liquid inside caught the light, looking innocuous, but carrying enough chemical weight to shut down the respiratory systems of 3 small children. She looked at her reflection, adjusting a stray lock of platinum hair. She looked perfect. She looked like the grieving mother the world wanted to see. She did not look like an executioner. Stop whimpering, she snapped without turning around. In the corner, Liam, Noah, and Ethan were pressed together so tightly they looked like a single trembling organism. They didn't cry out. They had learned long ago that crying only made the needle hurt more. They watched the woman who was supposed to protect them with eyes wide and dark with terror. They knew what was coming. The heavy limbs, the fog, the inability to speak or move even when they wanted to scream. 20 feet away on the other side of the soundproof wall, Julian Thorne was trapped in a hell of handshakes and champagne. Dr. Sterling stood beside him, gripping Julian's elbow with a possessiveness that made the billionaire's skin crawl. The older man was beaming, basking in the adoration of the donors. "You have done a great thing," Julian Sterling said, his voice booming. "By letting us manage the boys' care, you are ensuring the legacy of the Thorne name. The trust fund will be in good hands." Julian forced a smile that felt like it was carved out of stone. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that threatened to deafen him. He touched the pearl pin on his lapel, ensuring the camera was active. He couldn't leave yet. If he moved too soon, Sterling's private security team would intercept him before he reached the door. He was paralyzed by the very trap he had helped set, waiting for the signal that Simone was in position. Inside the room, Vanessa sighed, impatient with the delay. She checked her watch. 10 minutes until showtime. "Let's get this over with," she muttered. She turned and walked toward the corner. The click of her heels on the parquet floor was the sound of approaching doom. She didn't choose the boys at random. She went straight for Liam, the one who had dared to write music on the floor, the one whose eyes held the most defiance. "Come here, Liam," she commanded, her voice dangerously soft. "Don't make me call the guards. You know they aren't as gentle as I am." Liam shook his head, pressing his back against the silk wallpaper. He tried to shield his brothers, spreading his small arms out, but he was just a boy against a monster. Vanessa reached down, grabbing his thin wrist with a grip of iron. She pulled him forward, ignoring his silent struggle. "Hold still," she hissed, raising the needle. Julian outside felt his phone buzz once. The signal. But he was too far away. He couldn't get there in time to stop the injection. Vanessa uncapped the needle. The tip glinted. She aimed for the boy's thigh, prepared to plunge the plunger down and silence him forever. Just as the cold steel touched the fabric of Liam's trousers, the heavy double doors of the VIP room didn't just open. They exploded inward. The double doors crashed open, and Simone didn't just walk in, she attacked like a force of nature. She didn't scream or announce her presence. She simply launched herself across the room, a blur of beige polyester and raw maternal instinct. Her hand swiped through the air, knocking the syringe from Vanessa's grip, just inches before it pierced Liam's skin. The needle flew across the room, skittering harmlessly under a velvet armchair. Vanessa shrieked, stumbling back in shock. Before she could recover, Simone was already moving. She didn't chase the stepmother. She threw herself over the three boys, spreading her arms wide to create a human shield. She pushed them behind her, her body trembling not with fear, but with adrenaline. "Don't you touch them!" Simone roared, her voice cracking with the gravelly fake accent she had been using, but the rage was entirely her own. "Don't you dare touch them again!" Vanessa recovered quickly. The shock on her face morphed into a twisted mask of fury. She looked at her empty hand, then at the woman crouching over her payday, security. Vanessa screamed, her voice shrill enough to shatter glass. "Get in here! I am being attacked!" The reaction was instantaneous. Two massive men in dark suits burst into the room. They were the same hired muscle that had thrown Simone into the snow days earlier. They didn't ask questions. They saw a servant yelling at their employer, and they moved. "Grab her," Vanessa ordered, pointing a shaking finger at Simone. "Break her arms if you have to." Simone fought. She was smaller and outnumbered, but she fought with the ferocity of a wild animal. She kicked the first guard in the shin, sending him stumbling, but the second one grabbed her by the collar of her oversized uniform. He yanked her back violently, throwing her away from the children. Simone crashed into the vanity table, sending bottles of perfume shattering to the floor. She tried to scramble back to the boys, but the guards were on her. One pinned her arms behind her back, wrenching her shoulders until she cried out in pain. The other held her head, forcing her to look at Vanessa. Vanessa stepped forward, breathing hard. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the face of her attacker. She reached out and grabbed the coarse brown wig sitting low on Simone's forehead. With a vicious yank, she ripped it off. Simone's natural hair tumbled down. The thick glasses were next pulled off and thrown to the floor. "I knew it!" Vanessa hissed, a cruel smile spreading across her face. "I knew I smelled the stench of the ghetto. You just don't know when to quit, do you?" She slapped Simone. It was a backhanded blow that split Simone's lip. Blood trickled down her chin, but Simone didn't look away. She stared right back, her eyes burning with defiance. "You are done, Vanessa," Simone spat. "It is over." "Is it?" Vanessa laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Look around you. Who is going to believe you? The crazy ex-nurse who broke into a charity gala to attack a grieving mother." Vanessa walked back to her purse. Her movements were calm now, terrifyingly so. She reached inside and pulled out a second syringe. This one wasn't for the boys. She tapped it, looking at the liquid inside. "Hold her still," Vanessa commanded the guards. "I am going to give her a little dose, just enough to make her violent. Then when the police get here, I will tell them I had to defend myself. You are going to prison, Simone, and this time, you aren't coming out." She stepped closer, the needle poised to strike. Simone struggled against the iron grip of the guards, but she was trapped. The tip of the needle hovered over her neck. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was drowning in applause. 500 pairs of hands clapped in unison, creating a thunderous wave of sound that celebrated a lie. On the stage, standing beneath a massive LED screen displaying the logo of the Children's Hope Foundation, Dr. Sterling soaked in the adoration. He looked every inch the benevolent patriarch, holding a champagne flute aloft, as he finished his speech about the sanctity of family and the burden of care. In the front row, Julian Thorne felt a vibration against his chest. One short buzz. It was the signal from hell. It meant Simone was in the room. It meant the trap was sprung. It meant his children were currently in the line of fire. Julian didn't look at his phone. He looked up at the control booth high in the balcony where his head of IT was waiting in the shadows. Julian gave a barely perceptible nod. On stage, Sterling was beaming, and now he boomed his voice, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system. I would like to invite my son-in-law, Julian Thorne, to the stage, the man whose generosity makes this all possible. Julian stood up. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket with a deliberate, slow movement. He didn't smile. He didn't wave to the crowd. He walked toward the stairs with the stride of a man marching to an execution. The applause grew louder, unaware that they were cheering for the executioner. Julian climbed the steps. Sterling reached out to embrace him, to whisper some final manipulative word in his ear, but Julian stepped past him. He walked straight to the podium, gripping the microphone stand with both hands. The feedback whine silenced the room instantly. The applause died down, replaced by a confused murmur. Julian wasn't sticking to the script. He wasn't smiling. "Forgive the interruption, Dr. Sterling." Julian's voice was calm, deadly calm. It sliced through the room, carrying to the back corners where the waiters stood, freezing everyone in place. Sterling laughed nervously, stepping closer. "Julian is a bit overwhelmed tonight, folks." The emotion of the occasion. Julian didn't look at him. He looked directly into the camera lens, broadcasting the event to the giant screen behind him. He looked into the eyes of the donors, the politicians, and the press. "Tonight we have heard a lot about compassion," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave darker and heavier than anyone had ever heard it. "We have heard about the sacrifices made to protect the weak, but words are cheap, and in this family we prefer to show you the truth." Sterling sensed the danger. His smile faltered. "Julian, what are you doing?" "I think it is time we showed these generous people exactly what their money is paying for." Julian continued, ignoring the old man. "I want to show you the true face of the Sterling legacy." He raised his hand, a signal to the darkness of the control booth. High above the crowd, a loyal technician who had been paid 3 times his annual salary to ignore the hotel manager pressed a single key. Execute override. The massive LED screen behind the stage, occupying the entire back wall, flickered. The polite blue and white logo of the charity vanished. The image of smiling, healthy children vanished. The screen went black for a terrifying second, sucking the light out of the room. And then in its place appeared a nightmare in high definition. The feed from the hidden camera in the VIP holding room exploded onto the wall 30 feet high. The image was chaotic, shaky, and violent, but it was unmistakable. Chào bạn tỷ phú Đạt đây. Đoạn 19 là điểm bùng nổ của toàn bộ câu chuyện, The Climax. Sự thật trần trụi được phơi bày trước hàng trăm nhân chứng thượng lưu. Văn phong đoạn này cần sự hỗn loạn vỡ òa và thỏa mãn satisfying khi kẻ ác bị vạch trần. Dưới đây là nội dung chi tiết cho đoạn 19, được viết tối ưu cho giọng đọc AI, liền mạch giàu cảm xúc, không ký từ lạ. The image on the screen was not a glitch. It was a revelation. High above the stage, where the logo of the charity had been shining moments ago, there was now only the shaky, terrified footage of a hidden camera. It projected the truth 30 feet high and 50 feet wide, ensuring that not a single soul in the ballroom could look away. Vanessa Sterling was revealed in all her jagged, ugly glory. She wasn't the poised philanthropist in the modest black dress standing in the wings. On screen, she was a devil in silk. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure hate, her mouth open in a snarl that exposed teeth and gums. She held the syringe like a dagger. The audio cut through the polite silence of the Plaza Hotel like a chainsaw. "Die, you bitch!" Vanessa's voice boomed through the massive speakers, distorted by rage, but unmistakably hers. "You and these little bastards ruined my life. I will kill you all before I let you take my money." The reaction in the room was visceral. It started with the sound of glass shattering. A woman in the front row dropped her champagne flute, then another. Then the room erupted. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the space, followed instantly by a low rumble of horror and outrage. The donors who had just written million-dollar checks stared at the screen, realizing they had been funding a monster. Dr. Sterling, standing near the podium, realized his empire was burning to the ground. His face turned a shade of purple that matched the poison his daughter used. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the control panel. "Cut the feed," Sterling screamed, lunging toward the technician booth. "Turn it off now!" He moved to intercept Julian to shove him away from the microphone to regain control of the narrative. But he never made it. Julian Thorne stepped forward. He didn't step as a businessman. He stepped as a father who had watched this man destroy his family for years. When Sterling reached for him, Julian didn't flinch. He pulled back his right arm and unleashed 3 years of suppressed agony. His fist connected with Sterling's jaw with a sickening crunch that was audible over the chaos. The old doctor crumpled to the floor like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He lay there unconscious amidst the spilled champagne and the ruin of his reputation. Julian didn't even look down at him. His eyes were glued to the screen. In the video, the violence was escalating. Simone was pinned to the floor under the weight of the 2 guards. Her face was pressed against the carpet, her lip bleeding, but she wasn't screaming for help. She wasn't begging for her life. Even with a knee pressed into her spine, she turned her head toward the corner of the room where the 3 terrified boys were huddled. "Run, Liam!" Simone screamed, her voice cracking with desperation, but carrying the fierce command of a mother. "Run out of the room! Run to the stage! Find your father! Run!" The video feed shook as the camera captured Liam standing up. The boy looked at the door, then at the screen. And for the first time in his life, he didn't freeze. He moved. The mahogany doors of the VIP holding room did not just open. They splintered inward under the force of a battering ram of pure fatherly rage. The lock shattered, sending wood chips flying across the room like shrapnel. Julian Thorne was the first one through the breach. He was no longer the composed billionaire in the tuxedo who shook hands and signed checks. He was a force of nature. Behind him, his personal security team poured into the room, moving with the lethal precision of a SWAT team. They didn't shout commands. They didn't need to. They saw the 2 hired goons pinning a bleeding woman to the floor, and they engaged instantly. Julian didn't look at his children yet. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on the man holding Simone down. The guard turned surprised by the intrusion, his grip loosening slightly on Simone's neck. That hesitation was his last mistake. Julian didn't slow down. He didn't negotiate. He launched a kick that carried 3 years of blindness and guilt, driving his heel straight into the guard's ribs. The man grunted in agony, crumbling to the carpet, gasping for air. Simone scrambled free, coughing and clutching her throat, but her eyes immediately found Julian's. She didn't say a word. She just pointed a shaking finger at the corner. Vanessa was standing there, frozen. The second syringe was still raised in her hand, poised like a scorpion's tail. She looked at Julian with wild, dilated eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin another lie, but Julian was already on her. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was iron. He squeezed until the bones ground together, forcing a cry of pain from her lips. The syringe dropped from her numb fingers, falling to the floor where it rolled harmlessly away. Julian shoved her back, not with violence, but with disgust, sending her stumbling against the velvet wallpaper. "It is over, Vanessa." Julian growled, his voice vibrating with a terrifying finality. The room fell suddenly silent. The guards were subdued. The threat was neutralized. Julian turned slowly, his chest heaving, to face the corner where the triplets stood. He braced himself for their rejection. He expected them to scream. He expected them to run to Simone just as they had done in the nursery. He prepared his heart to break all over again. But then Liam stepped forward. The boy looked at the unconscious guards, then at the syringe on the floor, and finally at the man standing tall and breathing hard. He didn't see the stranger who ignored them anymore. He saw the man who had stopped the monster. "Daddy," Liam whispered. It was the first word Julian had ever heard his son speak. The dam broke. Liam didn't walk. He ran. He sprinted across the room, his small legs pumping hard, and collided with Julian's legs. Noah and Ethan followed instantly. They buried their faces in his tuxedo jacket, sobbing, not with fear, but with relief. Julian dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around all three of them, burying his face in their necks. He held them so tight, he was shaking, tears streaming down his face unashamedly. "I have you," Julian choked out, rocking them back and forth. "I have you. I am never letting go again." In the corner, Vanessa watched the reunion with a look of pure confusion. She smoothed her dress, trying to regain her composure. She opened her mouth to threaten him, to tell him he was making a scene, but then she heard it. It started as a low rumble and grew into a roar. It was coming from the other side of the broken doors. It was the sound of 500 people screaming in outrage. It was the sound of the world crashing down on her head. She looked at the open door, realizing for the first time that the darkness of the room was gone, and the bright, unforgiving light of the hallway was pouring in. And with it came the police. Julian did not raise his hand to strike her. Violence would have been too easy and far too merciful for the woman who had systematically dismantled the souls of his children. Instead, he grabbed the silk collar of her black dress with a grip that turned her expensive couture into a prisoner's restraint. He hauled her to her feet, not with the gentleness of a lover, but with the ruthless efficiency of a man taking out the trash. Vanessa stumbled, her heels scraping uselessly against the parquet floor as she tried to dig in and resist. "Let go of me!" she screeched, clawing at his wrist with manicured nails that left angry red welts on his skin. Julian didn't even flinch. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the stage door, the portal between the private hell she had created and the public judgment she deserved. He marched her out of the shattered VIP room, dragging her down the short corridor. She was dead weight, a frantic kicking burden, but Julian was fueled by an adrenaline that made him unstoppable. He kicked the heavy stage door open with a crash that echoed through the silent ballroom. The transition was blinding. One moment they were in the shadows of the wings, and the next they were bathed in the unforgiving white heat of the spotlights. Julian didn't stop until they were center stage, right next to the podium where her father still lay unconscious. He released her abruptly, shoving her forward. Vanessa lost her balance and fell to her knees in the center of the circle of light. The gasp from the audience was audible. 500 of New York's elite stared in horror. This was not the composed, saintly figure who had graced magazine covers. This was a woman unraveled. Her platinum hair was a bird's nest of tangles where the wig had been ripped away. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, exposing pale skin flushed with panic. Her makeup was smeared, giving her the appearance of a deranged clown. For a second, Vanessa was blinded by the glare. Then she saw the faces, hundreds of them staring at her with a mixture of shock and revulsion. Her survival instinct, the same instinct that had led her to poison children for money, kicked into overdrive. She threw her hands up, shielding her face, and let out a wail that was meant to curdle blood. "Help me!" she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "Please, someone help me! My husband has snapped. He is having a psychotic break. Look at him, he is violent." She scrambled backward, pointing a shaking finger toward the wings where Simone was still recovering. It was the help, she shrieked, eyes wide and wild. "That black maid, she drugged me. She forced her way in here and injected me with something. I don't know what I am saying. That video is a deep fake. It is AI generated. Julian is trying to frame me to avoid the prenup." She looked around the room, begging for an ally. She searched for a sympathetic eye among the women she had lunched with, the men whose donations she had courted. "Don't just stand there," she yelled, hysteria creeping into her voice. "Call the police, arrest him. Arrest. He is abusing me." But nobody moved. The silence in the Plaza Hotel was absolute and terrifying. The video loop on the screen behind her had stopped, but the image of her face, twisted in hate, was burned into their retinas. The donors looked at the woman on her knees and then at the man standing over her. Julian adjusted his cuffs, his face a mask of cold granite. He didn't defend himself. He didn't shout back. He let her scream. He let her spin her lies until they hung in the air like smoke. The crowd wasn't waiting for her to finish. They were waiting for the truth. They looked past the hysterical woman to the dark opening of the stage door, where three small shadows were emerging. Julian did not waste his breath arguing with a liar. He turned his back on the woman screaming about fake videos and deepfakes. He looked down at the three small boys who had just run through hell to find him. He saw the terror still lingering in their eyes, but beneath it he saw something new. He saw courage. He crouched down eye level with Liam. The boy was trembling, his small hands clutching Julian's pant leg as if he were afraid the floor would open up and swallow him. Julian reached out. He didn't ask for permission. He scooped Liam up into his arms. The crowd gasped again, but this time it was different. They were watching a father hold the son he had supposedly neglected. They were watching a billionaire hold a child who was shaking like a leaf. Julian walked back to the podium. He didn't speak. He adjusted the microphone stand, lowering the chrome neck until it was level with the 4-year-old's face. The room went deadly silent. You could hear a pin drop on the carpet. Everyone in that room knew the story. These were the Thorne triplets, the silent ones, the broken ones. Vanessa had built her entire charity empire on the lie that these boys couldn't speak, could not process language, and were trapped in their own minds. Vanessa stopped screaming. She looked up from the floor, a sneer forming on her smeared face. She was confident. She knew the medical files. She knew the damage the drugs had done. She thought the boy would just drool or cry, proving her point that he was mentally incapacitated. "Go ahead, Julian," she taunted from the floor. "Let him babble. Show everyone how sick he is." Liam gripped the metal stand with white-knuckled hands. He looked out at the sea of blinding lights. He looked at the hundreds of strangers staring at him. Then he looked down at the woman in the black dress. The woman who had pinched his nose to force purple liquid down his throat. The woman who had called him a freak. He took a deep breath. His chest hitched. He opened his mouth, and for a second, no sound came out. Vanessa started to laugh, a cruel, triumphant sound. But then the miracle happened. "She is a witch." The words were shaky. They were quiet. But they were English. They were clear. And they were amplified by the speakers to every corner of the ballroom. Vanessa's laugh died in her throat. Her eyes bulged. Liam wasn't finished. He leaned closer to the microphone, fighting through the residual fog of the sedatives, fighting through 3 years of conditioned fear. "She is a witch," Liam repeated louder this time, his voice gaining strength from the truth. "She made me drink the poison. She said I have to be dumb." The accusation hit the room like a physical blow. A collective intake of breath sucked the oxygen out of the Plaza Hotel. A boy who was legally classified as nonverbal, who was the poster child for severe cognitive disability, had just accused his stepmother of attempted murder in perfect sentences. But he stood alone for only a second. Noah and Ethan ran to the edge of the stage. They didn't need a microphone. Their high-pitched voices cut through the stunned silence. "Bad woman," Noah shouted, pointing a small accusing finger at Vanessa. "You are a bad woman." "We want Simone," Ethan yelled, jumping up and down, his fear replaced by anger. "Give us back Simone. She is our mom. You are the witch." It was over. The lie didn't just crack, it shattered into a million irreparable pieces. No spin doctor, no PR team, and no amount of money could fix this. The donors looked at Vanessa with pure revulsion. They realized they hadn't been donating to a saint. They had been funding a torture chamber. Vanessa slumped to the floor, the fight draining out of her body. She looked at the faces in the crowd and saw her reflection in their eyes. She wasn't the queen of society anymore. She was a monster caught in 4K resolution. Her career, her reputation, and her life as a free woman ended the moment a 4-year-old boy decided to speak. The silence following the children's accusation was shattered not by applause, but by the heavy rhythmic thud of combat boots hitting the marble floor. The double doors in the back of the ballroom swung open again, and this time it was not a grieving family or a curious waiter. It was the full force of the law. Dozens of uniformed officers flooded the room, moving with the synchronized discipline of a tide coming in to wash away the filth. Flanking them were men in windbreakers emblazoned with 3 letters that struck terror into the heart of any corrupt medical professional. FDA. The Federal Drug Administration had arrived, and they were not here for a health inspection. They were here for the head of the Sterling Empire. Leading the charge was not a police captain, but David Rosen. Julian's lawyer walked onto the stage holding a thick document that looked less like paper and more like a tombstone. He stopped in front of Vanessa, who was still kneeling on the floor, trembling in the harsh spotlight. She looked up at him, hoping for a negotiation, hoping for a deal, but David looked at her with the cold indifference of an executioner. "Vanessa Sterling," he announced, his voice amplified by the microphone that Liam had just used. "By the power vested in the District Attorney of New York and the federal government, you and your father are under immediate arrest." Vanessa shook her head frantically, her tangled blonde hair whipping around her face. "No," she gasped, backing away on her knees. "You cannot arrest me. I am a victim here." David opened the warrant. He read the charges loud enough for every donor in the room to hear. "You are charged with 3 counts of attempted murder in the first degree, aggravated child abuse, conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and the illegal distribution and administration of a Schedule I controlled substance." The words hit her like physical blows. Each charge was a nail in the coffin of her freedom. Before she could scream another lie, a female officer stepped forward. She didn't treat Vanessa like a lady. She grabbed Vanessa's wrists and twisted them behind her back. The click of the handcuffs locking into place was the loudest sound in New York City. The cold steel against her skin shattered whatever delusion Vanessa had left. The reality of prison, the reality of a cage, crashed down on her. She didn't maintain her dignity. She broke. "No," Vanessa wailed, kicking her legs as the officer hauled her up. "Daddy, help me. Julian, please. Tell them it was a mistake. I did it for us. I did it for the family." Julian watched her struggle. He watched the woman who had shared his bed and plotted the destruction of his bloodline be dragged toward the exit like a common criminal. He walked over to her one last time. He motioned for the officer to pause. Vanessa looked at him, hope flaring in her wild eyes. "Julian," she sobbed. Julian leaned in close. He didn't shout. His voice was a low rumble of absolute finality. "You never loved me, Vanessa. You never loved those boys. You only loved the zeros in my bank account. You loved money more than life itself." Well, take a good look at this room, because it is the last luxury you will ever see. You are going to have the rest of your life to count the days on a concrete wall. He signaled the officer to take her away. "Get her out of my sight." As Vanessa was dragged screaming into the night, followed by paramedics carrying her unconscious father, the ballroom remained silent. But it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of justice being served. Julian turned back to his sons, who were watching wide-eyed. The nightmare was officially over. Now the healing could begin. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel looked like a battlefield dressed in silk. The guests had fled the moment the handcuffs clicked, leaving behind half-drunk glasses of expensive champagne and scattered designer purses. The paparazzi had been chased out by the police, leaving the massive room in a strange, echoing quiet. The adrenaline that had fueled Julian Thorne for the last hour finally began to ebb away, leaving a crushing exhaustion in its wake. But he couldn't rest. Not yet. He handed Liam to a trusted officer and turned toward the wings of the stage. He pushed past the heavy velvet curtains into the dim backstage area. There, amidst the tangled cables and unused props, he found the woman who had saved his entire world. Simone was sitting on a dusty equipment crate, her back slumped against the brick wall. She looked terrible. Her face was already swelling where Vanessa had struck her. Her lip was split and bleeding. She was clutching her right side, her breathing shallow and ragged, a telltale sign of broken ribs from the guard's boot. She looked small, vulnerable. But to Julian, she looked like the strongest thing he had ever seen. He walked over to her. He didn't say anything. Words felt too small for this moment. He ignored the dust on the floor and the sharp crease in his trousers. The billionaire dropped to his knees in front of the maid. He reached out a trembling hand. His fingers, usually so sure and commanding, were gentle as he brushed a stray lock of hair from her bruised forehead. He used his thumb to softly wipe a smear of blood from the corner of her mouth. His touch was a silent apology, a silent vow of gratitude. Simone hissed in pain, but she didn't pull away. She looked at him with tired, warm eyes. "Did we win?" she whispered, her voice rasping in her chest as she tried to smile. Julian nodded, tears pricking his eyes again. He looked at her battered face and felt a surge of protectiveness that nearly brought him to his knees. "We won." Julian choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "We won because of you. It is all over, Simone." The flashing red lights of the paramedics cut through the shadows. 2 EMTs rushed in with a yellow stretcher. They moved efficiently, checking her vitals, asking about pain levels. When they lifted her onto the gurney, Simone winced, her hand reaching out blindly. Julian caught it instantly. He laced his fingers through hers, holding on as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the earth. "I am here," he promised, squeezing her hand. "I am right here." He didn't let go as they wheeled her out to the waiting ambulance parked at the service entrance. The cold night air hit them, but Julian didn't feel it. The triplets, refusing to be separated from their savior, scrambled into the back of the vehicle with them. The paramedic looked at the crowded space, about to protest that there was no room for civilians. But one look at Julian's fierce expression stopped him dead. "Family only," the medic said, looking at the billionaire in the tuxedo and the 3 traumatized children. Julian looked at Simone lying on the stretcher, then at his 3 sons huddled near her feet, holding onto her blanket. For the first time in years, he knew exactly who belonged in his life. "Yes," Julian said firmly, pulling the door shut. "We are family." The sterile beep of the heart monitor was the steady rhythm of the night. It was 3 in the morning at Mount Sinai Hospital, and the private suite was bathed in the soft blue glow of the medical equipment. To any outsider looking in, it was just a hospital room filled with the smell of antiseptic and the lingering tension of trauma. But to Julian Thorne, sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside the bed, it was the first time he had felt at home in years. He looked across the room at the narrow vinyl sofa pushed against the wall. It was too small for 3 growing boys, but that hadn't stopped them. Liam, Noah, and Ethan were tangled together in a chaotic heap of limbs and blankets. They had refused to go back to the mansion. When the nanny arrived with the driver to take them to their expensive beds, with the Egyptian cotton sheets, Liam had clung to the doorframe and screamed. He wouldn't leave Simone. So Julian sent the driver away. He ordered extra pillows and let his sons sleep right there where they felt safe. Julian stared at them, his heart aching with a fierce new love. For so long he had thought being a father meant providing the best things, the best schools, the best doctors, the biggest house. He had filled their lives with objects and left their hearts empty. He had let a wolf into their home because she looked the part of a perfect mother, while the woman who actually loved them scrubbed the floors. He looked back at the bed. Simone was asleep, her breathing deep and even thanks to the pain medication. Her face was a map of the violence she had endured for his family. The purple bruise on her cheekbone stood out starkly against her skin. The bandage around her ribs rose and fell with every breath. She looked battered, but to Julian she looked like an angel. She had done what his billions of dollars couldn't do. She had listened. She had fought. She had brought his sons back from the silence. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This was family. It wasn't about bloodlines or trust funds or galas at the plaza. It was this. It was refusing to leave the side of someone who was hurt. It was sleeping on a hard sofa just to be near the person who made you feel safe. It wasn't the mansion that made a home. It was the people who guarded your sleep. Julian reached out and gently covered Simone's hand with his own. Her skin was warm. Her fingers were rougher than Vanessa's, calloused from years of hard work and scrubbing floors, but they felt real. They felt like an anchor. Exhaustion finally began to pull at Julian's eyelids. The adrenaline crash was heavy and irresistible. He didn't let go of her hand. He rested his forehead against the side of the mattress. Just for a moment, he told himself. Just for a second. Hours passed. The sun began to creep through the blinds, painting stripes of gold across the floor. Simone stirred. The pain in her ribs was the first thing she felt, a sharp reminder of the battle. She groaned softly, blinking her eyes open against the light. She expected to be alone. She expected to be sent away now that the job was done. But then she felt the weight on her hand. She looked down. Julian Thorne, the man who owned half the city, was asleep, slumped over the edge of her bed, his hand clutching hers, as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling. The morning light filtered through the hospital blinds, casting long shadows across the sterile room. Julian Thorne sat on the edge of the bed, fully awake now. The vulnerability of the night before had been replaced by his business armor. He was a man who solved problems, and in his world, every problem had a price tag. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper and a sleek, heavy brochure. He placed them gently on the tray table in front of Simone. It was a cashier's check for $10 million and the deed to a penthouse overlooking Central Park. "This is the least I can do," Julian said, his voice steady but intense. "You lost your job, you lost your home, you risked your life. I want to make sure you never have to work another day in your life. The apartment is fully furnished. The money is tax-free. It is yours, Simone. Please take it." Simone looked at the check. The zeros trailed off the edge of the line. It was more money than she could earn in 10 lifetimes. It was safety. It was comfort. It was everything she had been struggling for in the Bronx. She looked at the glossy brochure of the penthouse with its marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows. Then she looked at Julian. A small, sad smile touched her lips. It wasn't a smile of gratitude. It was a smile of pity. She reached out with her bruised hand and slowly slid the check back across the table toward him. "I didn't do it for the money, Julian," Simone said, her voice soft but unyielding. "I didn't jump in front of a needle because I wanted a penthouse. I did it because I am a nurse. I did it because those boys are human beings, not assets. But you have nothing," Julian argued, panic flickering in his eyes. "You need this." "I have my conscience," Simone replied. "And that is something money cannot buy. If you think writing a check solves what happened here, if you think you can just pay me to feel better about your own blindness, then you haven't changed at all. You are still the same man who let a monster into his house because she looked expensive." She took a deep breath, wincing as her ribs flared with pain. "When I am discharged, I am going back to the Bronx. I am going to clear my name the right way. I don't belong in your world, Julian. It is too cold for me." The words hit Julian harder than the physical blow he had dealt to Sterling. She was leaving. The realization terrified him. He looked at the check, now worthless paper, in his hand. He had the money to buy an island, but he couldn't buy the one thing he desperately needed. "You can't go?" Julian stammered, his composure cracking. "The boys, they need you." As if on cue, the pile of blankets on the sofa stirred. The conversation had woken them. Liam sat up, rubbing his eyes. He looked at Simone, then at the check, then at his father's frightened face. He understood instantly. "No," Liam cried out, scrambling off the couch. He ran to the bed, ignoring the nurses who had just walked in. He threw his arms around Simone's legs, burying his face in the hospital sheets. Noah and Ethan were right behind him. They didn't scream. They just latched onto her. They held on with the desperate strength of children who had just found a lifeline and refused to let the ocean take it away. "Don't go." Liam sobbed, his voice muffled by the blanket. "Don't go, Simone. Stay." Simone looked down at the 3 weeping boys, then up at Julian. Her eyes filled with tears. The resolve to leave was strong, but the grip of those small hands was stronger. Julian stood there helpless, watching the only real family he had ever known breaking apart and begging to be held together. The check remained on the table, ignored and irrelevant. The real negotiation had nothing to do with money. It happened when Liam's small body suddenly arched in a spasm of pain, and a high-pitched cry tore through the hospital room. The drugs were leaving his system, and they were fighting to stay. Simone didn't look at Julian. She looked at the boy writhing in agony. She knew what was coming. It wasn't going to be a recovery. It was going to be a war. "I will give you 1 month," Simone said, her voice clipped and professional. "Not for you, but because no one else knows how to manage the dosage taper. After that, I am gone." Julian nodded, grateful for the reprieve. He didn't know yet that those 30 days would change him more than 30 years of building an empire. They moved the boys back to the mansion, but the East Wing was transformed. It was no longer a cold museum of expensive furniture. It became a triage unit. The withdrawal hit like a hurricane. The chemicals Vanessa had pumped into their small bodies were vicious. For the first week, the house was filled with the sounds of screaming and sickness. The boys sweated through their sheets. They shook so hard their teeth chattered. They vomited until they had nothing left in their stomachs. Julian Thorne, the man who commanded thousands of employees, ceased to exist. In his place was a terrified father in a stained t-shirt. He stopped answering his phone. The stock market crashed and rallied, and he didn't care. He was too busy holding a bucket for Ethan while Simone wiped the boy's feverish forehead with a cool cloth. He learned to do the dirty work. He learned that dignity had no place when your child was suffering. He changed soiled sheets at 3 in the morning without calling for a maid. He learned to mix electrolyte solutions with the precision of a chemist. He learned to sing soft lullabies to Noah when the tremors were too bad for the boy to sleep. It was in these dark, quiet hours that the dynamic shifted. Intimacy is not built on rose petals and champagne. It is built in the trenches of shared exhaustion. One night at 4 in the morning, Julian found himself sitting on the floor of the hallway next to Simone. They were both exhausted, their eyes dark with fatigue, smelling of baby powder and sickness. He handed her a cup of coffee. Their fingers brushed. It wasn't electric. It was solid. It was the touch of a partner. "You are doing good," Simone whispered, sipping the hot liquid. "You are a good father, Julian." Julian looked at her. He saw the messy bun, the no makeup, the sheer exhaustion on her face, and he thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. They were soldiers in the same foxhole, fighting for the same lives. And then as quickly as the storm had arrived, the clouds broke. One morning the fever didn't return. The shaking stopped. The boys woke up not with screams, but with hunger. Color returned to their pale cheeks. They sat up in bed weak but clear-eyed. The poison was gone. They had survived the fire, and as Julian watched them eat their breakfast toast, he realized the house felt different. It wasn't cold anymore. It was warm with life. The seasons had changed outside the high windows of the Manhattan Criminal Court. Winter had melted away, giving way to a tentative spring, but inside the courtroom the air was still frozen with tension. It had been 3 months since the gala. 3 months of rigorous investigations, depositions, and medical evaluations. Now came the final reckoning. Vanessa Sterling sat at the defense table. She was unrecognizable to the public who had once adored her. The platinum blonde hair was dull and unwashed, tied back in a messy knot. She wore an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on her frame. She rocked back and forth, muttering to herself, her eyes darting around the room as if chasing invisible flies. It was her final performance. Her legal team was pushing hard for an insanity plea, claiming she had suffered a psychotic break and was unfit to stand trial. They wanted a comfortable psychiatric facility, not a prison cell. But the jury was not swayed by theatrics. The prosecutor stood up and pressed a single button. The massive screens in the courtroom flickered to life. It was the footage Simone and Julian had secured. It didn't show a woman who had lost her mind. It showed a woman calculating a dosage with the precision of a chemist. It showed a woman checking her watch to ensure the timeline of the poison matched her speech. It showed a predator fully aware of her actions, planning a retirement fund on the graves of 3 children. The facade crumbled. Vanessa stopped rocking as the jury foreman read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The judge looked down over his spectacles, his face grim. For the calculated cruelty of your crimes and the violation of the most sacred trust between a guardian and a child, I sentence you to 25 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. You are a danger to society, Miss Sterling. Take her away. Vanessa didn't weep this time. She screamed curses as the bailiffs dragged her through the side door. She didn't look at Julian. She looked at the floor, her spirit finally broken by the weight of justice. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, and the silence that followed was the sound of freedom. It was over. Julian stood up. He felt lighter, as if a physical weight of $5 billion had been lifted from his shoulders. He turned to the woman sitting in the gallery behind him. Simone stood up, smoothing her simple skirt. She didn't cheer. She just nodded a quiet acknowledgement that the war was won. They walked out of the courthouse together. The heavy brass doors swung open, and they stepped into the blinding afternoon sunlight. The air smelled of rain and pavement. The paparazzi were there shouting questions, but they felt distant like buzzing flies that could no longer bite. Julian took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the fresh air. The ghost that had haunted his house was gone. The shadow was lifted. He turned to Simone, a smile breaking across his face, ready to propose a celebratory dinner, ready to start the next chapter. He reached for her hand, wanting to feel that connection that had sustained him through the darkness. But Simone didn't take his hand. She stopped at the bottom of the concrete stairs and turned to him. She didn't look like she was celebrating. She looked like she was saying goodbye. "The contract is up, Julian," she said, her voice soft but final. "The boys are healthy. They are speaking. The witch is in prison. My work is done." Julian's smile faltered. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I am packing my things tonight," Simone said, looking away toward the busy street. "I leave tomorrow morning. You don't need a nurse anymore, Julian. You are a father now. You can do this on your own." The mansion had never felt so big or so empty. For the last 24 hours, the silence that Julian Thorne had once prized felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. He stood in the middle of his library, surrounded by first editions and priceless art, but he felt like a pauper. Simone was packing. The woman who had breathed life back into his home was folding her sweaters and putting them into cardboard boxes. Julian paced the floor. He was a man who commanded thousands of employees. He had negotiated mergers that changed the economy of nations. But the thought of walking down the hall and asking a former maid to stay with him terrified him more than any board meeting. He was afraid. He was afraid that she looked at him and only saw the billionaire who had been blind to his own children's suffering. He was afraid that the gap between their worlds was too wide to bridge. She was fire and integrity. He was just money and regret. He needed advice, but he couldn't ask his lawyers. He couldn't ask his board of directors. He needed experts on the heart. Julian walked up the stairs to the nursery. The room was no longer the sterile white laboratory Vanessa had curated. It was a chaotic explosion of color and noise. Toys were scattered everywhere. The triplets were lying on their stomachs on the rug, surrounded by a sea of crayons and paper. Daddy Liam chirped, looking up with bright eyes. Julian sat down on the floor in his expensive suit, not caring about the creases. He gathered his 3 sons into a huddle. "I have a problem, boys," Julian whispered, conspiring with them. "Simone says she is leaving tomorrow. She says her job is done." The boys gasped. Noah dropped his blue crayon. Ethan shook his head violently. "No," Noah said firmly. "She can't go." "I know," Julian agreed. "But I don't know how to stop her. I have tried giving her money and she said no. I tried giving her a house and she said no. I don't know what to give her to make her understand that we need her." Ethan crawled over to a fresh sheet of paper. He picked up a red crayon. Then he picked up a black one. He started to draw with fierce concentration, his tongue poking out of the corner of his mouth. Liam and Noah joined him, adding their own touches to the masterpiece. Julian watched them, his heart swelling. They didn't need words. They communicated with the pure, honest instinct of children. After 10 minutes of furious scribbling, Ethan sat back. He held up the paper. "Give her this," Liam said solemnly. Julian took the drawing. It was crude. The lines were wobbly and the proportions were all wrong. But the message was clearer than any legal contract. On the left was a tall figure in a black suit holding a briefcase. On the right was a woman with curly hair holding a violin. And in the middle were three small boys holding musical instruments. But the most important detail was how they were connected. A giant red circle had been drawn around all five of them. And at the bottom, in shaky block letters, Noah had written a single word: team. It wasn't just a picture of people. It was a picture of a family. It showed Simone not as an employee, but as the missing piece of their soul. Julian felt a lump in his throat. This was it. This was the only currency that mattered. "Do you think she will like it?" Julian asked, his voice thick with emotion. "She has to," Liam said. "It is the truth." Julian stood up. He held the drawing carefully as if it were a delicate map to a buried treasure. He smoothed the edges. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. He wasn't going to offer her a check this time. He was going to offer her his heart. "Wish me luck," he whispered to his sons. He walked out of the nursery and down the long hallway toward the guest room where Simone was packing. His hands were sweating. His heart was pounding. He had $5 billion in the bank, but as he knocked on her door, he knew that the piece of paper in his hand was the most valuable thing he owned. The open suitcase on the bed looked like a mouth swallowing the last few months of her life. Simone folded a gray sweater and placed it inside, smoothing the wool with hands that were shaking slightly. She didn't want to go. Every fiber of her being screamed that she was making a mistake, that her heart was rooted here in this house with those three little boys. But her pride was stronger. She couldn't stay as a charity case. She couldn't stay as a paid employee in a house where she had fallen in love with the boss. It was too messy. It was too painful. She heard the door click open, but she didn't turn around. She knew his footsteps by heart now. "I am almost done," Simone said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The driver can take me to the station in an hour." Julian didn't answer immediately. He walked into the room, stopping just behind her. He didn't touch her. He respected her space, but his presence was a warm, heavy weight in the room. "Stop packing," Julian said quietly. Simone closed her eyes. "Please don't make this harder. I told you I can't take your money." "I am not offering you money," Julian interrupted. "And I am not offering you a job as a nanny. In fact, you are fired." The words hung in the air. Simone spun around, hurt flashing in her eyes. It was a slap in the face she hadn't expected. She thought they had built a mutual respect, but now he was dismissing her like a temp worker. "I understand," she whispered, reaching for the suitcase lid, trying to hide the wobble in her chin. "I will go now." But Julian stepped between her and the bed. He held out two pieces of paper. One was the crayon drawing from the nursery, with the word team scrawled in red wax. The other was a thick legal document bound in blue leather. "I am firing you as a nanny because you are overqualified," Julian said, his voice intense and serious. "I fired the entire board of the Thorne Foundation this morning. I need a new CEO, someone who understands medicine, someone who isn't afraid to fight for children, someone who can manage a $5 billion trust without stealing a dime." Simone looked at the contract. The title at the top read, Chief Executive Officer. It was a position of immense power. It was a career that would let her change thousands of lives. It was the respect she had been denied for so long. "But that is not the only position I need filled," Julian continued, stepping closer. He didn't kneel. He didn't pull out a ring or make a grand, theatrical gesture. That would have been cheap. He looked her straight in the eye, man to woman, equal to equal. "I don't need a nanny, Simone. I need a partner. I need someone to tell me when I'm being blind. I need someone to help me raise three genius boys who are going to change the world." He held up the drawing. "They voted?" Julian said, a crack appearing in his composed voice. "They want a mother. But I am selfish, Simone. I don't want you to stay just for them. I want you to stay for me. You didn't just save their lives, you saved mine. You taught me how to be a father. You taught me how to be a man. Without you, this house is just a pile of expensive bricks. With you, it is a home. Simone looked from the drawing to the contract, and finally to Julian's face. She saw the fear in his eyes, the raw vulnerability of a man laying his soul bare. The suitcase on the bed was forgotten. The pride that had told her to leave dissolved. She realized she wasn't being asked to stay as a servant. She was being asked to lead. She was being asked to love. "You are offering me a lot of work," Mr. Thorne, Simone whispered, a smile slowly breaking through her sadness. "Being a CEO is hard, but raising you might be harder." Julian exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. He dropped the papers on the bed and closed the distance between them. "I am a fast learner," he promised. And as he pulled her into his arms, the silence of the room wasn't empty anymore. It was full of promise. It was the beginning of a story that wasn't written in a screenplay, but in a life they would build together. The winter snow had long since melted, replaced by the lush green promise of summer. But the biggest change in the Thorne estate was not the season. It was the sound. 6 months ago, this house had been a tomb of silence, a place where children were seen and not heard, where music was a punishable offense. Tonight, the French doors were thrown open to the evening breeze, and the air was alive with melody. It was not a gala. There were no press photographers lined up at the gate. There were no donors writing checks for tax breaks. It was a gathering of 50 close friends, the loyal staff, and the doctors who had helped with the boys' recovery. It was a celebration of life. In the center of the grand living room, the furniture had been pushed back to create a small, intimate stage. Standing there were not 3 victims, but 3 musicians. Liam, Noah, and Ethan held their instruments with a confidence that defied their age. They looked healthy. Their cheeks were round and rosy. Their eyes were bright and focused, no longer glazed over by chemical fog. Julian stepped forward to introduce them. He didn't use a microphone. He didn't need one. "Welcome to our home," Julian said, his voice warm and relaxed. "Tonight, my sons would like to play something for you. It is a piece they learned in the dark. But tonight, they play it in the light." He stepped back and nodded to Liam. The boy raised his violin. Noah readied his cello. Ethan poised his hands over the piano keys. They exchanged a look, a secret telepathic communication between triplets, and then they began. The music that filled the room was breathtaking. It was intricate and complex, weaving together sorrow and triumph. It was the same piece Simone had heard them playing in secret on that snowy day 6 months ago. Back then, it had been a whisper of rebellion. Now it was a shout of freedom. The notes soared to the high vaulted ceiling, filling the space that had once been dominated by fear. Simone sat in the front row. She wasn't wearing a maid's uniform. She was wearing a dress the color of the midnight sky. Her hands were folded in her lap, and on her left ring finger sat a simple, elegant band of gold with a single sapphire. It wasn't a showy rock meant to impress society. It was a promise meant to last a lifetime. She watched her boys playing with such joy that tears streamed unchecked down her face. She remembered the nights of withdrawal, the vomiting, the screaming. She remembered the fear in their eyes when they saw a spoon. To see them now lost in the music was a miracle she had fought for with her own blood. As the final crescendo built, filling the room with a powerful, triumphant chord, Julian didn't look at the audience. He looked at Simone. He saw the way the light caught her profile. He saw the pride in her posture. He realized that every good thing in this room, every note of music, every smile on his sons' faces, started with her. She was the conductor of this new life. The music ended with a flourish. For a second, there was silence, and then the room erupted. It wasn't polite golf claps. It was thunderous, genuine applause. The guests stood up cheering. Liam, Noah, and Ethan bowed, beaming with pride, their faces glowing. In the midst of the noise, Julian walked over to Simone. He held out his hand. She took it, her grip firm and warm. He pulled her to her feet and kissed her forehead right there in front of everyone. "Thank you," he whispered against her skin, so only she could hear. "Thank you for the music." Simone looked up at him, her eyes shining. "We are just getting started," she promised. And as the music started up again, a lively, upbeat tune that made the children dance, Julian Thorne knew she was right. The silence was gone forever. The last guest had departed an hour ago, leaving the Thorne estate wrapped in a comfortable silence. It was not the cold, sterile silence that had haunted these halls 6 months ago. It was a warm, living silence. It was the sound of a home that had finally exhaled. Upstairs, the triplets were fast asleep, their dreams likely filled with melodies and applause. They were safe, they were loved, and for the first time in their lives, they were free. Downstairs, the only light came from the crackling embers in the grand fireplace. The orange glow danced across the Persian rug, casting long, soft shadows against the walls. Julian sat in his leather armchair, a glass of amber liquid resting untouched on the side table. He wasn't drinking. He was watching. Simone stood near the hearth. She had picked up the violin that Liam had left on the piano bench. She didn't play a symphony. She didn't play anything complicated or showy. She simply drew the bow across the strings, playing a slow, hauntingly beautiful lullaby. The notes floated through the dim room, wrapping around Julian like a blanket. He watched her fingers dance on the fingerboard. Those were the same hands that had scrubbed his floors, the same hands that had fought off guards, the same hands that had pulled his children back from the edge of the abyss. She finished the piece, letting the final note hang in the air until it faded into the crackle of the fire. She lowered the instrument, but she didn't move away. She turned to look at him, her face illuminated by the firelight. The bruise on her cheek had long faded, leaving only the radiance of a woman who was exactly where she belonged. "You are quiet tonight," Simone said, her voice soft. "I am just thinking," Julian replied, a small smile playing on his lips. Simone walked over and sat on the arm of his chair. She rested the violin on her lap and looked deep into his eyes. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if the weather had held?" she asked quietly. "Do you regret coming home early that day in the blizzard? If you hadn't come back, you wouldn't have seen the mess. You wouldn't have had your life turned upside down. You would still have your perfect, orderly illusion." Julian reached out and covered her hand with his. He thought about the man he used to be, the cold, distant billionaire who thought writing checks was the same as being a father. That man was a stranger to him now. "I don't regret a single second of it," Julian said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't regret the snow. I don't regret the shouting. I don't even regret the pain. Because that storm didn't destroy my house, Simone. It cleaned it. It washed away the lies." He looked up at her, his eyes shining with absolute certainty. "That was the best storm of my life. It woke me up. And it brought you to me." Simone smiled, and it was a smile that lit up the darkest corners of his soul. She leaned down and kissed him. It was a kiss of promise, a kiss of peace. As the fire burned low, casting a warm glow over the two figures huddled together against the vastness of the world, the truth became clear. Sometimes destiny does not knock on the door with a gentle, pleasant chime. Sometimes it does not arrive with an invitation. Sometimes destiny has to break the door down. Sometimes it has to come in the form of a storm, a crisis, or a shock to the system, just to wake up a heart that has been sleeping for too long. But when the storm clears, what is left standing is the only thing that truly matters: love. The screen fades to black. The story of the Thorne family serves as a powerful reminder that true wealth is never found in a bank account. For years, Julian Thorne lived under the illusion that providing for his family meant writing checks and signing contracts. He believed that a gilded cage was the same thing as a safe home, and that a high society reputation was more valuable than the truth. But he was sleepwalking through his own life. The most profound lesson here is that blindness is a choice. Julian chose to look away, because it was easier than facing the messy reality of raising children. But his negligence nearly cost him everything. We learn that status and titles are utterly meaningless if they are not backed by character. Vanessa wore the expensive dresses and carried the title of a philanthropist, yet she was a monster. Simone wore a maid's uniform and scrubbed floors, yet she possessed the nobility of a queen. It teaches us never to judge a person by their station in life, but rather by the content of their heart. A uniform does not define a person's worth, just as a designer suit does not hide a person's cruelty. Furthermore, this narrative highlights the immense power of advocacy. The triplets were silenced by fear and drugs, unable to ask for help. They were the voiceless. Simone taught us that when we see injustice, we cannot remain silent. Courage is not about having power or authority. It is about doing the right thing even when you are afraid, even when you are outnumbered, and even when it might cost you your livelihood. Simone risked her freedom to save children who were not her own, proving that love is an action, not just a feeling. Ultimately, this is a story about the difference between a house and a home. A house is built of bricks and filled with expensive furniture, but it can be cold and empty. A home is built on presence, on sacrifice, and on the willingness to sit on a hospital floor at 3 in the morning just to hold a hand. Julian's life had to fall apart before it could come together. The blizzard was not a tragedy, it was a salvation. It reminds us that sometimes our greatest challenges are actually blessings in disguise, designed to wake us up and force us to look at what truly matters. It is never too late to open our eyes, to admit our mistakes, and to fight for the ones we love. If this story touched your heart, and you believe that true family is worth fighting for, hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone you love.